everybody. So this is the bonus newsletter video for May 2023. I'm Aaron Simmons. For anybody who's watching this a month from now, when I make it public to everybody else not subscribed to the newsletter, please do check out jaronsimmons.com and get subscribed to the newsletter so you can get these bonus videos the instant they get released, the first of every month. Well, today I want to think with you about something that has been on my mind a lot lately. It is spring, and we're at that point in the year where, as a college professor, all the students are graduating. They're moving on to different stages of their life, to next steps. I have written lots of recommendation letters over the past few months. I have sat with advisees. I have had lunch and tea and coffee with more students than I can even count. And all those conversations have a very similar theme, which is, them trying to think about where they're going, how to do what matters in life, how to find their calling or their purpose, and thinking with me about how philosophy might help them navigate these very difficult, very complicated steps. Well, graduation from my university is next week, and so I am right in the midst of the kind of weird nostalgia that comes from having gone through a lot of graduations, both as a professor, but also in my own life, right? I graduated from high school, then my college degree, then 2 different master's degrees, and then a PhD, and all this work that I did. There were a lot of graduations, a lot of ceremonies and rituals to mark the occasion, to mark time, to make time matter. And to remind us that the work we've put in is significant, that it makes a difference, that being able to move to the next step is actually an accomplishment, something to celebrate. So while all of my students this week are donning their caps and gowns, putting on their sundresses, taking all of the pictures all over campus so that they can remember this time, they are also trepidatious and anxious about the next steps, the things awaiting them as they move on beyond college. And I think that this is actually a fitting time to think about something very philosophically important, which is the way in which our life unfolds in stages. Now, we could think about this as a kind of, positive psychology thing, like how do we navigate the different stages of life and have the right sorts of approaches to it to find, the strength we need for difficult days. And I think all that stuff's important, but I want to think about it in a more existential way. And I want to borrow here some ideas and develop these ideas from Soren Kierkegaard. He's a philosopher who anyone familiar with my work will know I am indebted to very deeply. I was a former president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society. I'm never too far from Kierkegaard whenever I think, whenever I write, and whenever I speak. And Kierkegaard has famously a 3-part stage, a 3-part development of stages. He calls them the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And he says that these are stages along life's way. And importantly, though, they're not stages in the sense of, at first we are one, then we move into this, and finally we achieve some great thing. It's not about just growing in wisdom. It's also about understanding the different dispositions that we have as people and the way that we, at different times in our life, relate to our lives themselves and the things in our lives differently. So I want to think through these 3 with you to help you kind of unpack it, to teach you a little bit of Kierkegaard, but then try to think about how Kierkegaard's articulation of these life stages might actually be relevant to where we find ourselves, whether getting ready to walk across the stage, graduating from high school or college, or if we're in our middle ages or later in life, wherever we are, maybe these different ways of making sense of how to relate to life can be valuable as we try to keep in play a tension between possibility, that which is unpredicted, that which is coming, that which we cannot yet fully understand. So possibility and also actuality, where we are here now and why it matters. The way I like to think about this is how to have the appropriate balance of expectation, anticipation, and contentment. How can we both be hopeful for something to come and also be joyful where we are. This is a hard task, but I think Kierkegaard maybe can help us live into it a little bit better. All right, so let's dive in. So the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The best way to think about these three different ways of living, three different stages of life, are the relationship that they have to immediacy. Now, that can sound very highfalutin, a lot of fancy pants, pixie dust sort of in the eyes kind of philosophy. What Kierkegaard means by this idea of immediacy is that in the aesthetic mode of living, we are immediately related to external objects without any extra narrative of their significance. So if I want an iPhone, if I want a new car, if I want to take a vacation, I'm excited about these things because I want those things, not because getting those things help me achieve something else. There is no in order to, it's simply the immediate desire and then the obtainment of that desire. So for the aesthetic way of living, part of what goes on is a radical dependence on the object of one's desire as determinant of one's own significance. Who I am becomes articulated and understood through what it is that I want. So the need to continue to obtain those things becomes really, really significant because that's what gives me back to myself, as it were, right? It's what allows me to feel like that I do matter, that my life is moving somewhere, that I'm actually making progress. We can see this, I think, in lots of ways, right? People often, need to lease a car every 3 years to always feel like they've got the new thing. People want their phones on shorter and shorter contracts so they can get a new phone every year or 2 years. This idea of always needing something new does have something to recommend it. I mean, there is an excitement to being able to find oneself faced with new opportunities. Again, this is what possibility announces. We like facing our life as full of possibility. That's in fact why I do have some nostalgia and some jealousy even, if I'm honest about it, regarding my college students heading off into life, right? The road opens to them. They have veritable endless options that they then now get to choose among. Well, at 45, I don't have that luxury in the same way, right? I've made choices. And so now I'm living into the results of those choices. And with every choice you make, you limit the set of options that then you face next time. So the aesthetic does have some very compelling aspects. It propels us forward. It keeps us moving. And in this way, the aesthetic's enemy is boredom. Getting bored, getting worn out in the mundane is precisely what the aesthetic mode of life, the aesthetic way of living hates. Kierkegaard calls this the idea of crop rotation. It's like a farmer who has to constantly change up what's being grown in the fields in order to keep the field fresh, in order to keep the soil ready for growing season. Well, if we just plant the same thing over and over and over, as farmers know, it will wear out the soil. It will drain it of nutrients. It will no longer be able to support life. In the same way, for those in the aesthetic mode, changing up what one desires, switching jobs, switching boyfriends or girlfriends, changing churches, finding different things to always keep you interested. This is what in many ways can propel us into life. So again, there's something commendable here. There's something exciting about this possibility of always being faced with new possibilities. But there's also a dark side. Kierkegaard says it leads to a very serious form of despair. Think about it. If we always want the new thing, we're never really wanting to have that thing. We just want to be the people who are always getting new stuff. But once we get the thing, we don't want that. We want something else that's new. So the very fact that it's worried about boredom leads to a kind of being mired in a kind of stasis. No matter where you go, there you are. No matter what new thing you get, it's not enough to suffice to give you the selfhood, the meaning, the purpose that you so deeply long for. So where do we go? How do we keep moving? What is it that we do to overcome that wrestling, that gnawing, that infinite sense that we aren't able to get what we really need? That despair, Kierkegaard says, is because we end up always losing our very selfhood in the process to find it in the immediacy of the desired object. We find ourselves through the Porsche and the mansion on the hill and the partnership at the job and the new spouse or partner. All of those things, which on their own might be fine, end up sucking away any sense of who we are because we are not anything but the reflected desire for something else. And this ends up being quite devastating. Contentment becomes nearly impossible. In fact, the example Kierkegaard gives is of a seducer who always has to find a new beloved, a new partner romantically. But the problem is that if the seducer ever marries the beloved or ends in a long-term relationship, it ruins the whole point. The point is the chase, right? It's not getting, it's the wanting that matters. C.S. Lewis even taps into this when he says at one point that joy is found in the desiring, not in the having. But of course, as you can see, if we only ever desire something new, something else, then we can never be content, never be fulfilled with where we are and who we are. In fact, we never know who we are because we are simply a pale reflection of the object that we think gave us purpose, but in fact just reminds us of the despair that we haven't figured out why we matter in the first place. So Kierkegaard says the aesthetic way of life is ultimately not going to be sustainable for long. And so the next stage he discusses is the ethical stage. So if the aesthetic was immediate, the ethical stage is defined by mediation, or something between ourselves and our desired object. So for example, in this sense, rather than the seducer being the sort of, paradigm example in the aesthetic, now we find Kierkegaard talking about a judge. Somebody who is the literal embodiment of a social role. Their job is not simply something that they do, it is who they are. Their social identity dictates their very selfhood. And we can see this in lots of other ways, right? Being a parent, being a child, being a student, being a professor, being a citizen, being a neighbor. All of these different ways in which we are identified socially can end up dictating how we make sense of ourselves. So it's not that I desire the new car because it's new, right? I instead desire to do the things that the person in this particular social location wants and does. So in this way, this is why he calls it the ethical, I am actually oriented towards some conception of the good or some conception of what's socially acceptable and right. So it now is not so much what is it that I want, it's what does one want in this sort of position. I evacuate myself in order to embrace the anonymity of this particular mode of living. And we all do this. Again, there's something that is compelling about this. Being a professor, there's all kinds of things that need appropriately to override my judgment about what is good and what is right, because these are just what professional standards dictate. And this is what it means to be a professor. And these are the kinds of things that professors do. And so therefore, as a professor, they're the kinds of things that I then do. This is not bad. It's actually good that we have lots of social expectations on how we live, how we move in life in shared spaces. This is in many ways why our radical freedoms must be constrained by some degree of social responsibility and an awareness that what I want to do actually has to be checked by what one should do given our social arrangement. But just like with ethics, this otherwise compelling mode has some problems. And it turns out the problem is exactly the same as in aesthetics. It's that it leads to despair. So even though we might say, well, isn't this so much better that now instead of just wanting an external object to give me validation, now I want to live into some social task, some role. I want to be the kind of thing that people can depend upon and they can expect. Yeah, but in doing that, part of the problem is then I also lose my singularity. I lose what makes me me. And maybe I just become that anonymous expectation. A lot of philosophers talk about this danger. Martin Heidegger refers to the they, right? We get dressed, we go, we believe like they do. We hear something, well, where did this come from? Well, they said it. And we navigate the world a lot according to what they do. Think about being in traffic. My goodness, when we're in traffic, a lot of times we'll shift lanes just because we see people shifting into a lane. So we think, oh, I should do what they are doing without having any other reason to do it except that's where people are going. People go where people go is basically a way of thinking about how the ethical mode, this universality of action and living, can in fact override our judgment about what we actually realize might be best. So in the very way that aesthetics, I ran into despair because I was losing myself in this immediate external desire. I always needed the new, something else to make me me. Now in ethics, the me is nothing but this reflection of what Heidegger calls the they. It's also what Kierkegaard will sometimes call the public, or what Nietzsche calls the herd. All of these are versions of a crowd mentality. It's a way of thinking that actually minimizes the importance of my being a singular self, affectively engaged in the world, defined by passions that really are not only different from others, but infinitely valuable just on their own sake. This is not what ethics actually reveals about myself. Ethics says that I matter insofar as I repress anything that would make me singular and merge into this universal invitation to be like everyone else. Again, aesthetics, ethics, lots to recommend it, but both of them lead to a kind of despair because both of them undermine the task of self-making, of my identity being an existential invitation. They settle the issue for me rather than me deciding what is it that I will be? Who is it that I am becoming? So this is where Kierkegaard says there's a third option, the religious. And by religious here, again, it's a complicated idea that we're sort of only scratching the surface of. But Kierkegaard's idea is here we get immediacy back, like we had in aesthetics, but it's an immediacy on the other side of being aware of the universal social expectations that do still press upon me. In other words, now I have to figure out who will I be, who am I becoming, in light of this social pressure and expectation to be like all the others. So now it's not just different for difference sake, aesthetic, nor is it fit in because it makes everything easier, ethics. It's really faced with the task. Who is it that you are becoming? Why does it matter to be invested in selfhood as a project, not just an assumption? Now, for Kierkegaard, he cashes this out, of course, by being in relation to God. But although I think it's important to read Kierkegaard in this very specifically Lutheran way, I think the existential import can be expanded beyond that particular understanding. God here can be understood as what is it that you find of ultimate value in a way that humbles you and elevates you at the same time? What is it that wrecks all of your presumptions of self-sufficiency while propelling you forward in the infinite importance of your decisions, your beliefs, your behavior? How can we both be radically humbled and yet defined by the confidence that even though life is risky, my direction holds? Well, this is why I define faithfulness as risk with direction. This is a Kierkegaardian idea, though he doesn't quite say it that way. Risk with direction is religious, whether or not it's determinately Christian or Muslim or Jewish, etc. It's religious in that it calls us to reconcile ourselves to what we worship, what we define as ultimate. Notice in the aesthetic, there ultimately was no ultimate. Everything was temporary. Everything was fleeting. Everything was a passing glance. In the ethical, the problem was not that there wasn't an ultimate, it was that the ultimate was something that had evacuated my investment in it, right? I became irrelevant to the role that I played. Now in the religious, the ultimate matters precisely as a willed task I take up as the directional risk of my life. And that's hard. It's here with these three in mind that we can begin to realize that it's not so much we start aesthetics in our teens and then we become ethical in our 20s and then ultimately in our 40s or 50s we become religious. It's not a progression in that sense. These are more different ways of relating to the world at different times, given different circumstances. Sometimes it's really, really important to be ethical in this Kierkegaardian sense. Again, when I'm a professor, I've got to think a lot about what is it that a professor does. In other ways, being aesthetic makes a lot of sense, right? Being able to work for something, to desire an object, be able to obtain that object. In many ways, all those graduations that I've gone through, that my students are about to experience, is a kind of actualization of those very temporary and external desires. There's nothing wrong with that in principle. But in order to realize, like, being ethical, being aesthetic, that these are appropriate in certain ways, it's also really crucial not to think that they are all-consuming, that they somehow get to dictate who we are. There's more to us, says Kierkegaard. And that more to us, I think, is the ability to keep in play our hope with our contentment, our expectation for the possible with the comfort in actuality. This is hard work. It's hard to do. I'm 45, turning 46 this summer, and there are many days when I think, man, if only I were 23 again. But there are more days, increasingly more days, that I'm actually good with being 45. That doesn't mean I don't have desires for new things. I'm working hard trying to get a new bike that allows me to progress in my mountain biking. I absolutely love being able to go on vacation with my family, be able to work hard and save money and make these things happen. But realizing that I'm okay, even if those things don't happen. I tell my students a lot that the goal of philosophy is to realize that we are okay even if things aren't. That's what the religious mode of living invites us to realize. Again, religious here, not in the sense of determinate, confessional articulation of God, but in a embrace of the humility required when we recognize that we are not, in fact, the final standard. And yet we are infinitely valuable. It matters that we matter. And because we matter, who we are becoming itself is the most important question. So I don't know if this is helpful to you, but it certainly is for me. In many ways, I'm speaking to you today, thinking through the things that I've been thinking about while talking to all of my graduating seniors in the past couple weeks. They're getting ready to walk across that stage, head off into a world defined by possibility. But then at some point, they're going to have to be okay being 45 and 60 and maybe even 80. And if they only are the external achievement, if they only are aesthetic, then they will likely be despairing for most of their life. Always trying to get something else, be somewhere else, do something else, instead of being comfortable with who they are. If it's all about ethics, then they are likely to find esteem in the eyes of other people, but never be comfortable with themselves. They are likely to be applauded, but not actually find the peace that comes when the applause stops. But if we can find a way to invite ourselves into the religious, even if not all the time, ultimately find ourselves there, then it allows us to be ethical and be aesthetic in appropriate ways. We can now be deployed on purpose in ways that make sense. We know that non-ultimate things are non-ultimate, but still might matter. And yet we also know that we matter because of this ultimate singular value that defines our being, regardless of the cars and the houses and the jobs, and regardless of the social praise and social status and social esteem. Anyway, there's Kierkegaard's 3 stages. There's a lot more we could say. If this were a Kierkegaard seminar, obviously we would unpack this in a very different way. But I'm trying to think with you about how it is that we can, at 45, live with the hope and expectation and excitement of the aesthetic, but without the despair that defines it. And how we can also, whether 45 or 20 or 65, live with the contentment that does not close down and does not forestall the importance of continuing to move forward. We are beings who are directed toward something. Make it matter. Anyway, I do deeply appreciate you thinking with me, balancing expectation and contentment, possibility and actuality. Please do reach out here on YouTube, comment. I'd love to be in conversation with you. Send me a message via my website. Reach out to my email, simmonsphilosopher@gmail.com. Any way that I can be in touch with you and think with you. I really do appreciate your time, your energy, and your investment in walking together and talking along the way. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.